little bit about Dr. Samantha Duggan. She's a behavioural psychologist and a former lecturer at the University of St Andrews School of Medicine. She specialises in family systems, and her private practice work focuses on helping parents improve their ongoing parent-child communication and facilitate psychologically healthy child development. Dr. Duggan is secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for 12-Step Recovery and a member of the UK Government's Office for Health Improvement and Disparities Mutual Aid Reference Group. Through this work, she has in recent years become known as a public advocate for 12-step recovery in its many forms. Her talk this evening is titled Surrender, the Heart of 12-Step Recovery and Emotional Sobriety. So with that, Samantha, let me hand it over to you and just thank you so much for coming to speak with us.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. It's a real honor to be asked. And I'm going to begin my talk tonight on the 25th of October, 2007. And that, in fact, was, it was a morning, much like any other. It was a working day, and I woke hungover. And there was nothing particularly unusual about that, I'm afraid. I had a job and I had 2 small children. And the night before, I had intended only to go out after work and have 1 or 2 drinks. But of course, that set up the usual process, and I ended up drinking far too much and waking the next morning in the state that I'm sure many of you who are in 12-step recovery who are joining in will be familiar with. I was regretful, remorseful, embarrassed, ashamed, and bewildered, like really, really, really baffled about how this had happened to me again. I had lots of willpower and I had been trying to control my drinking for a very long time. But that morning, without me knowing it, I certainly didn't have the words to describe it like this at the time, but that was the morning of my first surrender. And what did I surrender that morning? Well, the way I would put it now is that that was the morning that I surrendered the illusion that I could control my drinking. And that was the necessary first step to get me onto this journey of 12-step recovery and right to the heart of what I think is a really important engine for transformation. The transformation that we discover can happen to us if we're willing to keep walking the path of happy destiny. And I got really interested in emotional sobriety very early on. I'll explain why that was. But I've come to the belief that surrender is the engine that drives us forward right from that first moment when we perhaps have that moment of clarity that gets us into 12-step recovery in the first place. So a little bit more about me. I had a PhD in psychology when I got to recovery. I know a lot of people, when they get to recovery, they become very interested in the psychological world, often going and doing degrees, training to become therapists and that. But I had already had that interest before I got to recovery. And in fact, when I look back, I thought, my goodness, it was my PhD was littered with coincidences that became part of my step 2 process. So in fact, my PhD work, I had studied post-traumatic stress disorder, and without realizing that I had post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, for example. I had to ask patients how much they drank, and I'd been taught to always double it. When you ask people how much they drank, just automatically double it, they said. And I did that whilst being in denial about my own drinking. This one was really remarkable to me. I ended up reframing all of these things, all of these coincidences, actually as like breadcrumbs that my higher power was leaving me unbeknownst to me. So I had the first academic paper that I'd ever worked on was helping my PhD supervisor to prepare a paper on post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms in people who had survived esophageal variceal hemorrhage. Yeah, that is when people, alcoholics with late stage liver disease, actually projectile vomit copious amounts of blood. It has a very high fatality rate, but some people do survive. And my supervisor was very interested in seeing if people were traumatized by that event. And we went on and did work to try and understand what protected people from developing worse symptoms of trauma, even though they had experienced very serious and life-threatening illness. So yeah, I was a psychologist already, but when I got into recovery, I became particularly interested in the spiritual component of the program, getting very, very interested in that, devouring books on spirituality of all different flavors. And then I ended up doing a master's in theology, where I got to indulge that new habit and interest. And I eventually did my master's dissertation on, well, it was a comparison of 3 different types of spirituality, including 12-step recovery. I'll explain more in the next slide, but let me also just explain a little bit about the all-party parliamentary group for 12-step recovery. I'm doing a series of 3 talks for this group, and my next talk is going to actually talk all about that work. But you can hop on and have a look at the 12-step APPG website. But for those who don't know, an all-party parliamentary group is a cross-party. So we've got 2 houses of parliament here in the UK. There's the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And to have an all-party parliamentary group, you have to have members from both houses. Think like having people from the Senate and the House of Representatives if you're American-based. So you have to have people from both houses, and you have to have people who are from the 2 parties, from the governing party and from the opposition party. And basically we put down political differences, and we don't even speak about that. And we just work on advocating for an issue that is close to all of our hearts. And in our case, this is 12-step recovery. We're particularly interested in looking at policy and seeing if we can make recommendations for where it could be improved. But in fact, we've discovered that actually UK policy around addiction and recovery from addiction is pretty good. In recent years, there have been updates and changes to it. So really, we're working really hard to try and make sure that that really rather good policy is implemented. And in order to help with that, I've become involved with a charity called Visible Recovery, where we advocate for a type of recovery which we call anonymous but not invisible. And it's not for everybody, I recognize that, but for some people who are willing and ready, we encourage people and give them support to be more open outside of the rooms about being a person in recovery, perhaps in social settings where they wouldn't normally consider it, or maybe even in professional settings, something I have taken a step into myself. So tonight, I'm presenting my work from my theological spiritual work from my master's. I studied, it was called Lessons from Surrender, a comparative study of surrender in Christianity, Islam, and 12-step recovery. I looked in particular at 17th century French Catholicism, 12th century Persian Sufism, and then, of course, 12-step recovery. And I focused in particularly on the picture of surrender that we find in Drop the Rocks, steps 6 and 7, even though they're not normally considered as the surrender steps. So I'll be talking about that later on in this talk. But before I move on to the next slide, I just want to point this out. I was looking around for images for this presentation, and I found this mud circles image, and I thought it looked a lot like a mandala. I think it's really quite beautiful. And the artist created it in Dublin, which is where I'm from, in the Guinness Hop Store in 1984 as part of a poetry festival that was launched in Dublin that year. And they are, it can be hard to see when you're not up close, but they are mud prints from the mud of the River Avon, creating this mandala-like circle. And I thought it was a beautiful image of surrender because, you know, whether we're thinking judicially or militarily or spiritually, the universal symbol of surrender is this kind of open-handed, hands-up position. So I chose that for that reason. I'll be talking about these 7 points as I move through the talk. And then I decided as well to add in 3 lessons, which I would say are more from my own personal experience of being in recovery. So I'll elucidate that as I get towards the later part of my presentation here today. And I thought I'd include this image as well, because I've certainly found that one of the ways in which I can practice surrender is through imaginative contemplation of these images, which for me anyway embody the concept of surrender. So this is a close-up of the mud handprints that were creating the mandala in the image from before. Right, so lesson 1. Surrender is necessary to make psycho-spiritual progress in life. Without learning or mastering the mysterious art of surrender, there will be, I'm afraid, no emotional sobriety. It's necessary for psycho-spiritual growth. And we've sort of known this always as human beings, whether you call it enlightenment or self-actualization, or holiness, or emotional sobriety, or divinization, as the Eastern Orthodox traditions tend to think of it, or simply maturity. Surrender is how we harness the transformative power to keep us moving forward on the ever-narrowing path towards maturity, enlightenment, emotional sobriety. And surrender, in fact, gets us in touch with that power that's beyond ourselves, which some people conceive of as the divine. And this knowledge, it's very, very ancient. I chose this image here. This in the central image there, that's a Minoan poppy goddess. The Minoan civilization was found on the Greek island of Crete. It disappeared around about 1100 BC and was present there on the island from, it's a little bit tricky to get a date. Some say 2000 BC, certainly by 1400 BC, it was in its ascendancy. And we have lots of these sculptures, I suppose you'd call them, or statues today, which show that by then we already understood that you could heal, be transformed, gain wisdom through the power of surrender to the divine. And I think it's interesting as well that the poppies are there on the central image to show that by then we have always known, as long as there have been people, there has been drug and alcohol use in order to try and transcend our own mundane existence here on this planet. And one of the things I looked at as well as part of my PhD, or sorry, as part of my master's, was this incredibly detailed review by an academic called Mary Beth Mose. And she has called surrender an alchemical act of transformation. And I think that's a lovely concept because, of course, in alchemy, the precursors to today's chemists, the alchemists were taking base metals and trying to turn them into gold. So in other words, to take something that, well, maybe not worthless, but certainly not valuable, and to transform it into something that was really precious indeed. And I love that idea, that because that's been my experience. We who are in recovery, we take the pain and chaos and heartache and heartbreak of active addiction, and through surrendering, we transform it into something really precious. Our experiences can benefit others. And so this, I think, is a really important key to recovery. I know there are other keys to recovery, of course, sobriety, service, sponsorship. But the thing I'm saying, I suppose, in this presentation is that surrender is a really, really important part of it as well. So surrender is necessary, but I think recovering people love the idea that religion is not. So this became very clear in my work. While surrender has an extensive literature in all the religions of the world, as far as I could see, it's not necessary. And the way I put that in the language of my work was that the physical and metaphysical structures of religion are not necessary for surrender. And I think this is very fortunate indeed for, certainly people like me who don't really want to be told what to do. So religion is not necessary, but nevertheless, look at this. I think this is an incredible image as well. So here we have, I mean, it looks like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pilgrims to Mecca. And I love the way their bodies communing together in this collective act of worship, which for me speaks of what we do in the rooms. You know, we recover together in the rooms as well. And here we see that people are coming together to pray and to seek transformation as well. And I love that their bodies are forming a mandala as well. But you don't need to go to mosque. You don't need to perform the salat 5 times a day. So why do people do it? Why, all through history, people have become part of religions. Usually people have been born into it. They have doctrines, they have teachings, they have practices. Orthodox Jews, the scholars of Orthodox Judaism, have devoted many years to memorizing every word of the Torah by heart. And I'm fascinated by this idea that mosques and temples and churches and synagogues, why did they spring up if they weren't necessary? So my sponsor, by the way, is a Buddhist, a very devout and practicing Buddhist who does this kind of thing every single day. She loves to say to me, it's a practice and it's a daily practice. So here we have again this beautiful imagery of the glorious temple that people have built, where they come and together as a we practice moving towards enlightenment. And I think we sometimes forget today, because in our Western cultures, at least, most people now are probably not religious. The percentages are growing all the time of people who don't subscribe to any particular religion. But historically speaking, this is highly unusual. And I think even today, the majority of people in the world probably are religious, even if we aren't in our part of the world. So if all of this isn't apparently necessary, why did they bother with it? And I refer us here to page 87 of the big book, which is, you know, I have many favorite lines and many favorite paragraphs from the big book, but this is one of them. Bill W. wrote, "Be quick to see where religious people are right. Make use of what they offer." And what I want to offer as a suggestion here tonight is that maybe if we're wanting more emotional sobriety, we could go back and check to see if we've maybe skipped over this line, that, you know, we might find some of these ancient practices and devotions incredibly helpful to our own quest for emotional sobriety. And this image here, by the way, maybe somebody might recognize it if you know London well. This is the Brompton Oratory in London, an incredibly beautiful Roman Catholic church. And here again, we see those common elements that we find in all the faiths nowadays. You see people coming together, we see them facing something that is outside of ourselves, something very, very beautiful. I think this is incredibly beautiful. And that we element. I also thought this image was glorious because of that light coming in from the window on the left-hand side. And I think many people can find it easy to have their breath taken away when we catch a glimpse of clouds parting and rays of sunlight coming down through. It's not hard for our imaginations to go to thinking about something transcendent and beyond us when we see something like that. So this brings me to my next idea that I'd like to speak about tonight. So we've already established, or at least I had established satisfactorily to my mind, that surrender is necessary, religion is not, but not all surrender is equal. There are at least 2 types. These are called esoteric and exoteric. And in order to make progress towards the goal of emotional sobriety, you have to balance these 2 things. So the way I've encapsulated this in one simple sentence is effective surrender is esoteric and exoteric. Or if you prefer, effective surrender is inwards and outwards, upwards and downwards. Esoteric refers to things that are secret, hidden. Esoteric knowledge is known only to a few. Exoteric is to do with the externals, the world outside of ourselves. It's easy to see. And I think, again, we know this. We've worked out a lot of this stuff for ourselves in 12-step recovery. So when we go to a meeting, even though we don't want to, that's exoteric surrender to a 12-step practice that we have figured out, those who've gone before us have figured out is good for us. And so we surrender in that way. You know, we get clever feet and we take them to a meeting. We are surrendering exoterically. However, to have gone to a meeting at all in the first place, you probably have had some sort of moment of clarity and internal transformation that made you willing to go to the meeting in the first place. Other examples of exoteric surrender that maybe many of us have engaged in is, you know, being told by a sponsor to get on your knees in the morning and pray to a God that you didn't believe in and didn't understand, and you really weren't too sure about this, but you do it anyway. You demonstrate your willingness and you get down, or at least I did. You know, I got down on my knees and I said that prayer of surrender, of willingness to grow and absolutely desire to stay sober. So I was manifesting my understanding already of the fact that exoteric surrender is necessary. But you can get caught in either of these. I mean, if we think of those stories, again, the stories are so similar. We know that Siddhartha, the Buddha, as he was to become, went and sat under the Bodhi tree for years, waiting for enlightenment. And when he finally quit that and came back in to the world, that was when he achieved enlightenment. Saint Benedict of Nursia, he did the same thing. This is the founder of the Benedictine order. He went off and lived in a cave, so horrified was he by the dissolution of the world around him that he went off hermit style and lived in a cave for some 3 years, being a holy man and attaining and seeking union with the divine. But eventually he came back in and he founded his monasteries. And in fact, when he wrote down his rule of Saint Benedict, he has a special section reserved. He's got quite a poor opinion of people who spend too much time on their own, isolated, meditating and praying alone in caves. And I thought it was really interesting as well, because I think even before recovery, I encountered Eckhart Tolle, and he spent a couple of years, if my memory serves, on a bench in Germany, communing with the divine, I suppose, completely surrendered. But this is esoteric surrender on its own. And I don't know about you, but, you know, now that I'm sober, I'm not particularly keen on hanging out on benches overnight. So effective surrender is esoteric and exoteric. And that made sense to me because the divine is immanent and transcendent. And I was really interested to learn that the cross is a symbol of this immanent and transcendent quality of the Godhead. So again, you can think about within and without for immanent and transcendent. What is transcendent is way beyond us. It's beyond our understanding. It's beyond our knowledge. It's beyond our ability almost to capture it in words. It's breathtaking in how far beyond us it is. This is the feeling we get when we look up at the stars, and we kind of know this. We know this about God, and this is the up-down line of the cross. It's not just an instrument, a Roman instrument of torture and execution. So that's the up-down, the beyond us, the above, and you need an amount of that. I believe now you need an amount of that idea in your concept of God. God is also immanent. So God is within. This is the still small voice within. And I think a lot of people in recovery, they try out that transcendent thing. They get on their knees, they pray to that God, they might check out some of these religious type buildings. And then in the end, they come to prefer the idea that God is within and that they need to get in touch with their inner wisdom and listen to that. And that's not wrong. But again, it's this question of balance, because, you know, better folk than we have figured this out before us. So I really liked that discovery that the cross was this encapsulation in one symbol of the immanent and transcendent Godhead. The next lesson, and I love this lesson, surrender leads to peace. So sometimes we use the word acceptance more in the world of 12-step recovery to talk about this, but, you know, the subtitle of one of the texts that I looked at in my research work on this, the whole book was called Trustful Surrender to Divine Providence, The Secret of Peace and Happiness. So these were some of my earliest, most painful lessons in recovery, that unless I surrendered, I would not find peace. And I had already experienced so much peace just as a result of not being accidentally drunk all the time and being able to maintain this peaceful sobriety of an evening as long as I didn't touch the first drink. So, you know, I had tasted that and I wanted more. Because the more that you find you're able to surrender to whatever is going on, so, you know, acceptance is the key. That's a very popular way that we have of putting it. If you're fighting anything or anyone, then you cannot, as far as I can see anyway, I've tested this, I cannot be at peace anyway. And when I went and I dove into the literature of these different ancient traditions, I discovered that they all said the same thing. That if you want emotional sobriety, that using the modern psychological language that we like to use nowadays, you're going to have to figure out how to surrender. And I was super grateful that, you know, without knowing it, you pick your first sponsor and you maybe don't know an awful lot at all about your first sponsor, but my first sponsor, I love to honor her as much as possible. Her name was Michelle. I moved country when I was 10 months sober. So Michelle took me through my first 3 steps and taught me such a lot. And she died a few years ago sober. But one of the greatest gifts she gave to me was that when I was only about 4 or 5 months sober, she told me to go by the language of letting go. And she introduced me to a whole new way of learning to surrender and find peace. And then the other great thing that she gave me was, she said to me, Samantha, I don't want your image of serenity to be you sitting on a beach in Bali, meditating, looking at the sunset while listening to the glorious sound of waves lapping on the beach. I want your image of serenity to be a bird sitting on a branch of a tree surrounded by a storm. And I went, okay, that, you know, and I duly did as I was told. And I found this image served me so well because I was able to latch onto it when the storm started to blow around me. And I love this image. I was so pleased about doing this talk because I'd never actually gone and found an image to, you know, to print out and picture. I'd always only ever had it in my mind. So I was rooting around, you know, good old Google. I was rooting around and looking for an image to share with you about that lesson in surrender that I had got. And I found this one, and this is my perfect bird on a branch in a storm. I highly recommend that you just review your vision of peace, serenity. You know, is it one I found some people have shared with me that, you know, they, like my sponsor warned me about, they have these images of peaceful places, but actually I have found that an image of a not peaceful place with you peaceful in the center of it, it's been very effective for me anyway. Surrender is a paradox. This is a statue called the Hand of God. Surrender is it's a human act. We have to do it, but it's made possible only by God. This is the paradoxical idea of powerlessness that we have at the heart of our 12-step recovery. And the exact same thing occurs in Christianity and occurs in Sufism as well. Sufism, by the way, I assume many people probably know, but for anyone who doesn't know, it's the mystical branch of Islam. So in admission of defeat, you find power. By admitting that you've come to the end of your rope, you reach out and look up and you find power from somewhere else. And this is a sculpture by a Swedish artist. He called it the Hand of God. You can still see it. There are a few reproductions of it in different places. And I've shown it from these two images because I think it's interesting that from one side, it looks almost like the image, the person is falling. And from the other side, it looks more like a cooperation, to me at least. But I think a lot of people relate to the footprints idea that, you know, when there was just one set of footprints, it wasn't that we'd been abandoned by God, it was that God was carrying us. So I like this idea that God is always carrying us. So the hand of God, I thought I'd put that in there. And I also discovered that this idea, there's one of the most famous verses in the Quran is, I'll need to read this for you so I don't get it wrong. So whomever God wishes to guide, he expands his bosom to surrender. So, you know, surrender is a paradox. It's an act of the will. You've got to do it yourself, but ultimately it's made possible only by God. And I thought I'd include this idea as well from Sufism, the path of effort and the effortless path. And I know within Buddhism, we have this idea as well. You know, there's the path of least effort, I think, is that what it's called? I'm sure there are people who know a lot more than me about this. So, you know, surrender isn't just about doing. It's very important that we learn how to allow surrender to happen as well. And I can't recall which meeting I ever heard it in, but equal parts effort and letting go. There have been phases in my recovery when I'm doing step 6 and 7 and I'm putting in too much effort actually, and I'm not getting the results. And it's only when I actually remember to humbly ask that the removing happens. So yes, we do the work of becoming willing, and we, you know, there's a lot of work involved and we need to be willing to go to any lengths, but the removing in some mysterious way also happens not by our power. Right, the last idea from my master's is that surrender requires trust. And I love that step 2 comes immediately after step 1. So, you know, we've surrendered, we've admitted powerlessness, we've got a little bit of power come in. And then the next thing we're asked to do is to trust something outside of ourselves. And for some of us, that's really difficult. And, you know, I've talked already about how in the West, at least, so many of us now are coming to 12-step recovery and we've had no contact or knowledge of God before. We're being raised in a basically secular atheist culture. So this can be hard for us. And we've heard so many times about people who walk into rooms, see the word God on the scrolls. And it occurs quite a number of times. Even though it's God as you understand him, or God as you understand God, it's still there. And a lot of people turn on their heels and they go straight back out. But to the extent that you can do this, you're going to find surrender easier. So, you know, we can take small steps. First, I trusted these people in the room who seemed to have their lives together much more than I did. Then I trusted my sponsor and I did what she told me to do. And then little by little, I began to trust more and more. And I started to do this praying thing. And, you know, one of the fruits of prayer I've found is that your trust grows. A word here, I just want to talk as well about the prophetic things that Bill Wilson put into the book. So we've all heard of the poor unfortunates, those who cannot or will not give their lives to this simple program. And that was Bill grasping at something that we've now shown to be correct. So according to Erik Erikson, the earliest stage of human development is where when we're very, very little, those first couple of years of life, we either learn through the responding of our caregivers to have a basic trust or mistrustful orientation towards the world. And what we're learning now, the work of Gabor Mate, for example, a lot of people have heard of him. It's now apparent that it may be the case that some of the people who are not able to get on with our 12-step recovery program are people who have poor trust. They may have a wound at a very early stage of development. It may be a little bit later, but their trust has been deeply wounded. And I think it's incredibly interesting now to find that Bill was right. There are people whose trust is very low, but there is hope, because there are researchers, people like Dr. Matthew Bräuninger now, are working on how we can develop programs to help people like that improve their trust, and particularly their ability to trust in a higher power. So that's the bit from my master's work. And now here we come to the part where I'm just going to speak a little bit about some of the ideas I've got from my own experience of recovery. I've already mentioned that my sponsor likes to say to me a lot, it's a practice, it's a daily practice. And, you know, the 12-step process I've found, and many people before me have found, it's a reliable map out of chaos and into order. Or, as we love to put it in recovery, we arrive restless, irritable, and discontent. And we undertake this journey to happy, joyous, and free. And for me, this image here on, well, it's on the left. This, by the way, this is a surrealist artist from 1960. She created this image, and the minute I saw it, I thought, that's the one that speaks to me of how my head was when I got to recovery. It was fragmented, disintegrated, painful, chaotic. It was a washing machine head, an unsafe neighborhood, a place I should not go on my own. I was told that whenever my head started to get the better of me and I couldn't banish whatever nonsense it was telling me, that I should pick up the phone before I picked up a drink. And once I did that, it started to improve, and I started to move towards that feeling, that more frequent feeling of joy, which I think is even deeper, more abiding feeling than happiness. I can remember, so I got sober in Spain, actually, and I was going to English-speaking meetings, so I had to drive quite a long way, and the coastal path in the part of Spain, or this coastal road in the part of Spain that I was living in, it's a beautiful drive, and I was so happy to not be drinking anymore. I can't tell you the relief that I found. And that was the first moment when I felt joy. I didn't know it was joy at the time, you know, but I can remember the drive and going, oh my goodness, the way the thought formed in my mind was, it's okay if I die now because I've felt this and I know that I'm going to be okay. So the journey takes practice. You don't just go automatically from restless, irritable, and discontent to happy, joyous, and free. You have to put all of these different practices in place, and then you have to practice them over and over. The literature on expertise is really clear. It takes 10,000 hours to become an expert in anything. Now, I haven't counted up my recovery hours. I doubt I'm at 10,000 yet, but, you know, I've clocked up quite a few. And again, we know this, we encapsulate it in our little thing that we say at the end. You know, it works. It really does if you work it. So just a word about the steps, and in particular, I'd like to talk about step 11. So, you know, I got to recovery. I'm being told I have to pray for a sober day, right? Yeah, I'm praying for a sober day. There's the whole step 3 prayer. I'm doing that, yeah, in long form. When I'm in a rush, I do what I was told was the NA prayer of step 3, or I heard a great Al-Anon one. I can't, he can, why don't I let him? You know, so I had short ones for when I needed to get going quickly with my day. I was also doing an awful lot of praying for people I had resentments towards, as I had been told to do, and I was finding it was working. And I do it, you know, like lots of us. Sometimes I do it with more willingness than other times. But I found it worked. You know, if I kept it up for 2 weeks on a stubborn one, it would often go, sometimes a few days, and it's vanished. So I was doing a lot of that type of praying. And then one night I was at a meeting, if anybody knows the Surrey area, I was at a meeting over in Godalming, and this lovely lady was in the chair telling her story. And at some point in her chair, she said, I remember the moment when I noticed there was a second part to step 11. And that became the moment that I noticed there was a second part to step 11. So I'd already got the sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. I'd been doing these 2 other types of prayer that I'd been told to do, But then I noticed that step 11 prayer is really very much about what's your will for me, and can I please have the power to carry that out? And you know, I love that. I love that in one step alone, that's not even usually associated with surrender, we find, in my opinion anyway, a complete guide to surrender that will lead to peace. I thought as well I'd put this up and talk a little bit about the surrender steps, as I call it. So if you Google, you'll find that step 1 is the one that's frequently associated with surrender, though often step 3 is associated with surrender. You make a decision to turn your will and your life over. That's clearly an act of surrender. I've talked as well about how the second step of trust, it's hope in this nomenclature, but often, you know, they have it there on step 5, is a trusting step as well. But what I've come to believe anyway, and, you know, be interesting to hear what people think about this afterwards, is that actually so many of the steps are associated with surrender, not just the first one or the third one, if that's the system that you prefer. So I think that the second step, the third step, the 6th and 7th, and certainly the 11th steps all require surrender. And, you know, when I moved to this country, my wonderful sponsor, Alison, she often used to say to me when I'd ring her with a dilemma, I had many dilemmas in my early days, and I would ring her. She was so patient with me. It was so wonderful. So I would ring her with my dilemma, and, you know, she had 2 favorite things to say. She'd say, "What would love do?" And the other thing she'd say is, "Just pick a step, pick any step, Samantha, and just work that step." And I didn't really know what it meant at the time, but I did it. But now, as the journey has continued, I sort of understand a bit better now what she meant. It's like there's surrender in there in loads of the steps, and I continue to practice them to this day. The last thing I'd like to try and speak about is the difference that I've discovered between surrendering and surrendering to. And now that I'm looking at them there on the screen, actually, I'm thinking I should have put them the other way around. So a little bit about the image that you're looking at on the screen. This is the Cueva de los Manos, the Cave of the Hands in Patagonia in Argentina. It dates they're not, you know, again, it's hard to date these very, very ancient things, but we're talking maybe 7,000 BC, 5,000 to 7,000 BC. They think that the hand pictures or the hand images, hand paintings are for. This is an extensive system of prehistoric artworks in caves. There are images of animals and hunts and so forth, but there are also loads and loads and loads of these hand images. And I think this is fascinating that, you know, it's the point again that we seem to be, that I seem to be drawn towards concluding, is that as long as you're alive, you're going to have to learn how to do this surrender thing. You know, it's this act of reaching your hands out and up and searching for help from beyond you. But I also use this image because when I first caught sight of it, it spoke to me of pain. And I think that one of the reasons, this is speculation, I don't know this, but I like to speculate. But I think one of the reasons that the degree of emotional sobriety that I wanted at first, the degree of that eluded me, was because I hadn't yet figured out how to surrender to my pain, to my painful feelings. This was quite easy to surrender. There was something really rational about that. I got to Alcoholics Anonymous. They told me that I'd have to surrender this, that the problem was the first drink. I was like, okay, got it. I surrendered it. And my craving left. I don't know exactly when, you know, but relatively early on, you know, I didn't experience a horrendous protracted period of wanting to drink it. I surrendered that very quickly. I surrendered to the suggestion of the fellowship to not have the first drink, and I surrendered my alcoholism quite early on. However, then came my anger. And for the first couple of years, I would say that I had quite a nice pink cloud period. That's not to say there weren't ups and downs, there most certainly were, but by the time I was 2, 3, 4 years sober, it was now apparent that my anger was, I mean, it was massive. And so I had to surrender to that. And that was tough because in my training, we had to study Freud somewhat. And I was told that there was no catharsis for rage. But here I was feeling this like massive rage inside me. And so I developed a number of ways that I could surrender to it. One of them was to do these mad, angry crayon drawings. And so I kept boxes of crayons and paper nearby for me to do these. I put a mattress up in a shed in my garden, and I would go out there and kick and hit the mattress. I had a row of lilande trees at the back of my garden as well, and I would go up there and gutturally scream this anger out where it couldn't harm any of the people that had unfortunately triggered it. So I took responsibility for it. I surrendered to it. That was a deeply uncomfortable stage of my recovery. And then eventually I became able to surrender it when it was less intense. Inner children, something that's very difficult to surrender to. But uncovering, thanks to my wonderful sponsor in Codependence Anonymous, she helped me to identify, integrate, befriend lots of my inner children. And now I have this little nursery where some of them live. We have despair child, alarm child, Janie, who is angry and 19 and drinks all the time. So a whole little grouping of them. And I recently found a new one. She's called We Might Be Late. But they don't get in the driving seat these days. But there was a period of surrendering to the feelings that they brought up and the wisdom that they were trying to convey to me before I could surrender them and learn to not come from that place all the time. Despair, the despair. Let me just quickly tell you about despair and my journey in surrendering to and then finally surrendering despair. So I understood from early on that self-pity was something I couldn't afford very much or very well. I was still powerless over it. And thankfully, it tailed off and I became much more even in my emotions. But I would still have these moments of what I called catastrophizing. So, something would go wrong and all of a sudden it would be an absolute disaster. And I called it catastrophizing because, I'm a psychologist and I quite like the psychological language. And then I started to go to this new home group about 8 years ago. And we read the step 11 prayer at the end of every meeting. And it uses that nice old fashioned language of the St. Francis prayer. And it says, where there is despair, let me bring hope. And a few months of hearing that all the time. And I realized that my highfalutin catastrophizing was really just despair in 5 syllables. And once I realized that that was what it was, I became willing to surrender it. And it started to become much less and now eventually mostly a thing of the past. I'm going to give the last word to grief because grief and sorrow is incredibly difficult to surrender to. And we all have grief. I mean, beginning with grieving the loss of the life that we might have had if we'd found recovery earlier. That's a very common one, I find. Grieving the loss of all the drinking we're going to do in the future. I find as well people who get into recovery very young, that's a really tough one. They have to grieve that. They have to learn to surrender the drinks, the future drinks that they would have had. But if we bypass this stage of our development and we attempt not to feel that grief, well, it's really just spiritual bypass. We have to go into the feelings and learn what we learn the wisdom that they're trying to share with us before we can successfully let them go. I'm going to give the final word, well, the second to last slide, to Bill. The expression emotional sobriety, I've certainly become aware of it from this AA Grapevine article that Bill wrote in 1958. I really think he was a great pioneer. Let us, with God's help, continually surrender these hobbling demands. So surrender as a word doesn't appear in the first 167 words of the big book or in the 12 and 12, but here it is in the Grapevine in the article where he called it emotional sobriety. thank you for listening. I look forward to the Q&A session that we're going to have now. And my suggestion is to have a go. If any of the ideas that I've put forward here today appeal to you, if any of them stick in your memory, then have a go of integrating it into your 12-step recovery practice, however it is that you do it, and, you know, give it a month and see how you find it. Thank you for listening.